Okay.
Welcome,
All right.
everyone.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Excited to be with you. So we're going to start with just a brief body scan. So I'm just getting myself set up in my chair, and you can, maybe just give yourself this little gift. I feel like we get so used to trying to multitask, and there's so much we have that we really do need to get done. But this is a way to bring us home, to bring us together in this space. So just take a moment. You can close your eyes if you like. You can look down if you prefer. Spread your feet on the floor. If you're wearing shoes, do the best you can. Otherwise, you could spread your toes. Take a deep breath. And then we're going to do some progressive relaxation. So you can squeeze your toes and relax them. Take a breath and move your way up your body. So your calves, and squeeze and relax them. Thighs, and squeeze, relax them. Your belly, squeeze and let it out. Maybe take a moment to take a breath there. Send some love. And then move up. You can scrunch your shoulders up toward your ears in a truly horrible way, and then let them back down. Maybe allow yourself to roll them to the back. If you're a classroom educator or anyone working with students or anyone, could imagine people coming in feeling pretty tight up here, holding a lot of stress, and what it might mean to allow a few moments together. Just to let it go and squeeze your fingers, a tight fist. Let it go. Scrunch your face. Let it go. And maybe take your head to one side. You could use your hand for just a little gentle pressure if you'd like, but not a big push here. Just stretch your neck, and if it feels good, you can take your opposite arm and move it a little bit to help find the spot that really needs some breath. And do the other side. And we'll just come back, take another gentle breath. And as you feel ready, you can flutter your eyes open, come into the space. Great. Well, I know I'm in the right place for me, because that's the sort of thing I like to do. And I had to remind myself, no one's irritated about a mindful moment at Educating Mindfully. This is our jam. So this is called Discovery Mode, the role of mindfulness in adult SEL. You may hear my 1-year-old in the background. I am from CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. So a little bit about me. My husband calls this picture the angriest Girl Scout in the world. But I think actually I look kind of like an embodied and confident young woman in this picture. I was also a little bit anxious. And as life dealt me some punches, as it has for all of us, including my father dying 4 years later, I really struggled. And it was in my 20s that I came to yoga and meditation as tools to help me stay grounded. In my late 20s, I became a 7th grade teacher, language arts, here in Chicago. And it was stressful sometimes, being a new teacher with 32 students. But I found that without necessarily trying to make the connection, what I had learned about mindfulness really did impact the way I created my classroom, the way I built relationships with students, and the way I was able to make some space for learning, for discovery, for some joy for myself and my students. And now I work as a practice specialist at CASEL, and mindfulness still plays a really big role in how I'm coming to the work. In particular, in my work reviewing evidence-based programs to support student and adult SEL. And what I'm finding is, because I have this lens, I see mindful awareness practices throughout these programs, even when the mindfulness is not being explicitly referenced. So taking that learning, my goal for this presentation is to share the way that I'm seeing mindfulness playing into adult SEL, give some practical examples of tools or strategies, and I'm going to weave in some stories from my time teaching. So CASEL, as I said before, is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, and we're a trusted source for knowledge about high-quality, evidence-based SEL. We're working with educators and policy leaders to ensure that students from K to 12 have access to SEL. So some of you might recognize the image on the side of the screen, the wheel. So if you look on the inside, these are 5 interrelated competencies that CASEL has lifted up as very important parts of our framework. So there's a self-awareness and self-management, the inner personal, social awareness and relationship skills, intrapersonal, and then responsible decision-making, which really pulls from all of these. And then if you look to the rings around, you'll see these are the contexts where we know that learning and development happen. And so we feel for SEL to be equitable and for SEL to be effective, we have to really honor and engage with all these different levels. So thinking about the classroom, schools, families, and communities. So just take a moment and read through this definition of social emotional learning from CASEL. And using the chat when you're ready, I would love for you to pick out just a word or phrase that stands out for you. Great. See healthy identities, empathy, process, personal and collective goals, empathy, healthy identity, supportive relationships. Great. Thank you. Managing emotions, being integral part of human development. Great. So I'd like now to go back to that definition of SEL. And I've also put up John Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness, the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. And I'd love to use the chat again, just as a way to make this interactive. Where do you see connections or crossover between this definition of SEL and this definition of mindfulness? Hmm, great. This idea of paying attention and awareness, a skill or a practice. Skills. Mhm. Can't do SEL without mindfulness. Great. Thank you. So when we're talking about adults, because we know that when we're talking about SEL, we are talking about adults and students. What are we talking about when we're saying these, we need educators with strong social, emotional, and cultural competence? And I think that we're talking about people who are often able to engage in radical self-awareness, become master power sharers, and invest in creating spaces of empathy and belonging. And as a lot of you have sort of already called out in the last chat we did, mindfulness isn't called out here explicitly, but I think that this emphasis on self-awareness, social awareness, self-regulation are so connected to what mindfulness promotes. And so even when I talk to people who don't have a mindfulness practice and they're talking about adult SEL, I see so much crossover happening. And some of it may be raising awareness about that relationship. So reflecting on your current practices, you don't have to chat this in if you don't want, but just maybe think about where you see your own strengths and where you'd like to grow when you're thinking about these practices. So the research is in, adult SEL matters. This is something that you all probably know. This is something that CASEL sort of discovered through the iterations of our work with districts, how much, when we were bringing different programs to students, the role of the adults became so clear to us. There's the fact that the emotional skills of educators influence student conduct and engagement and attachment and performance. There's the issue of stereotype threat. So when students have questions about their belonging, they search for cues to signal whether they fit in and are valued. And Zaretta Hammond has said this can lead to a type of racially charged amygdala hijack. So important for us as educators to remain really aware of the messages that we're sending with our body and our voice. And I think that self-awareness is huge there. And then I love this quote from James Baldwin, because I think it says it all so well. Children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them. So thinking about who we are as the adults in our room, and it's a big responsibility. It's sort of overwhelming, I think, sometimes to realize how much the adult in the room impacts everything that is happening with students in terms of like co-regulation. So even though we have the power to create these environments where all students feel a sense of belonging and agency, and I would venture to guess that's why many of us went into education. I know that's why I did. We're human, right? So there are still some barriers to accessing that skillfulness, especially in stressful moments. So the first is triggers and threat responses. So when the amygdala goes into overdrive, our focus narrows and we become reactive instead of responsive. It can be such a stressful job, I have found. And then once you start getting in that like tight focus, you lose access to your capacity for flexible problem solving. And sometimes, unfortunately, even for empathy. I think we've all known colleagues who maybe have felt a little burned out and started to lose their capacity to really see the perspectives of their students. And then implicit bias and cultural frames. So we're all cultural beings with our unique frames. And if we're not self-aware, these can lead to biases that we're not even aware of, but we may act on. And one thing I found in my own class is that this can cause us to misread our students' behavior and to subconsciously send messages that don't support them. And the last is this idea of negativity bias, that our brain tends to sort of glom on to what's negative, not always see the positive, and that this can interfere with our social awareness. So wouldn't it be nice? It would be amazing if my class had always looked like this, with students engaged and learning, and I'm sure the teacher is mindfully weaving throughout the different students, just asking the perfect question at the perfect time. But we're human and we get hooked. So what can we do? So I'm going to go through some thoughts about the competencies and mindful awareness. And I'm also going to sort of weave in some stories from my time in the classroom. So the promising practice, number one, is knowing you are hooked. When I was reviewing these slides this morning, for the first time, I saw the little swimmer out there. And I really felt like, oh, this is the perfect metaphor for how I felt sometimes as a teacher. You know, I was just a little in over my head. So knowing you're hooked, this is CASEL's definition of self-awareness. The abilities to understand one's emotions, thoughts, and values, and how they influence behaviors across contexts. This includes capacities to recognize one's strengths and limitations with a well-grounded sense of competence and purpose. So it's Monday morning, and I'm standing in front of the class trying to get them focused. No one is listening. It's out of control. I feel helpless and worried that my principal is going to walk by. He had this thing for order. And suddenly I just stopped. I took a breath, felt my shoulders up somewhere around my ears, and recognized that I literally felt like a bull running from red cape to red cape. Mindfulness strategy. Paying attention to how the moods of people and places around you register in your body. Notice when your breath is shallow or your shoulders are hunched. So I think that this idea of sort of trying to notice how we feel in our bodies before we're triggered, to sort of make that a practice that we're doing all day, can help us for the moments that we are hooked to recognize and take a breath. Promising practice number two, widen your aperture. I connect this one to CASEL's competency of self-management, which we define as the abilities to manage one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors effectively in different situations and to achieve goals and aspirations. This includes the capacity to delay gratification, manage stress, feel motivation, and agency to accomplish personal and collective goals. So once I paused, I was able to take a breath and use something that I had remembered learning from my time doing meditation, which is a simple phrase of stop, be, look, see. And when I really slowed down and looked around, describing what I saw to myself, I noticed that things were not so dire. If you remember, I had felt like things were completely out of control. But once I really looked, I saw that Blanca was trying to get a pencil from Marissa, who was rooting around in her backpack. I did see that Diego was purposely kicking Elaine's chair and trying to get a rise out of her, and that a couple other students were finishing up conversations from outside. But most of my students were journaling, which was our routine for Monday morning, and they were ready to engage and learn. So the mindfulness strategy here, take a breath and internally say, stop, be, look, see. I have noticed that a lot of the programs that I review, the evidence-based programs for CASEL, include, even though they might not call it this, some kind of like mindful moment, a pause, something that teaches students how to make that little bit of space so that they can start using whatever the other skills are that we teach them for problem solving. And I think, without that space, we can teach the problem solving all we want, but when you're hooked and reactive as an adult or a student, that's exactly what you lose access to, your toolbox. Promising practice 3, seeing who is there. So this I connect to social awareness. CASEL defines this as the abilities to understand the perspectives of and empathize with others, including those from diverse backgrounds, cultures, and contexts. This includes the capacities to feel compassion for others, understand broader historical and social norms for behavior in different settings, and recognize family, school, and community resources and supports. I feel like right now, especially for our students, that last one feels extremely important, being able to see where your supports are. So what does it truly mean to see our students in the moment? How can we pull ourselves out of the stories of who they are or who they might have been yesterday? Now that I had done some self-regulation, I could see that the class was mostly focused and calm, but there was still the question of what was going on with Diego. He had come in unfocused and disheveled, and instead of falling into just some easy automatic explanation for his actions, I felt calm enough to ask him. So I caught his eye and tried to unobtrusively gesture for him to come talk to me. I asked what was going on, and I really tried to listen deeply to his responses. He had argued with his dad that morning, and the bus had come before they had had any kind of closure or conclusion. And just like me, Diego was stressed. So I asked him what he would say to his dad now that he had had some time to think about it. The mindfulness strategy I was using there is getting curious about what your students are experiencing, asking questions and listening deeply to their answers. One trick I used to do, I don't know if it's a trick, but for anyone who has large rooms filled with many students, when I needed to talk to a student, I would ask them to come stand by the door, and so that we were sort of away from the class, I would stand this way so that I was facing the class so that they still sort of felt my presence and I could, make sure everything was all well, and then had that student face me. So that way we had a moment of one-on-one time. And I think they felt some protection because they weren't facing the class. So like they kind of had a bit of privacy. I know that at some of the districts we work with are doing sort of a checkout system now where maybe a social worker or a principal, instead of coming to talk to that student, will take over the class because we're just finding it so important to have the repair and the connection with the classroom teacher. And I'm promising practice for choosing how to respond. This I connected to responsible decision making. And we're defining that as the abilities to make caring and constructive choices about personal behavior and social interactions across diverse situations. So this includes the capacities to consider ethical standards for safety, to evaluate the benefits and consequences of different actions for personal, social, and collective well-being. And I know one of you pulled that out in the chat. I think that's really important, and that's part of CASEL's updated definition, is being really explicit about that collective well-being part. Because that matters. And when we make that space internally, that's when we can be responsive and we can think about who we want to be as educators and what types of environments we want to create. Diego got under my skin sometimes. It's true. He was really silly and he could be pretty immature. But once I calmed myself and had spoken with him directly, I could choose to tune in to how challenging it is to be a 7th grader. There's just so much expectation, so much change, and to ground myself in my own values. What was more important to me, that my principal thought my class was under control or that Diego felt accepted and valued. I could get into my own values. This wasn't about me. I could be a supportive witness, maybe even a guide. I asked Diego if he wanted to write a brief note to his dad, just explaining his perspective and how he felt about their argument. He did, and then he joined the class. And he was still a little silly, but he was ready to learn. So the mindfulness strategy here, practicing non-identification and aligning your actions to your deepest values to create a space of empathy and belonging. And I think for many of us as educators, what can be helpful too is having that developmental perspective that Diego's actions were actually quite well aligned to a 12-year-old boy's actions. It might not have been what I wanted him to be doing, but it really had nothing to do with me. But since things don't always go as planned, so I was able just now to take, maybe a 5 to 10 minute experience from my teaching where I felt like I really employed mindfulness practices to support my adult SEL. But there were many times that I did not show up in the way that I hoped for my students, or that I struggled to embody the kind of empathic approach that I really believed in. So what happens when we mess up? We're human. If you didn't respond mindfully, you can practice self-compassion. Mindful teaching is a lifelong practice, and we are working towards progress, not perfection. I think that for those of us who've come to education because we really care about students and about our connections to them, feeling like we have somehow violated that connection, even in a small way, can be painful. So just being as kind to ourselves as we would to them or to a friend, and then repairing the harm. So checking in with students, acknowledging what happened, and apologizing when the situation calls for it. And then using that opportunity to authentically model competencies. I think the good news is students learn so much from us when we've made a mistake and responded well, much more probably than if we were just able to always model the best behavior. So allowing some grace and finding opportunities for ourselves to model competencies like relationship skills, using I statements, apologizing, seeing someone else's perspective, showing what that we understand where they might be coming from. We're not going deep into this, but if this is something you're interested in, the International Institute for Restorative Practices is a really, really a powerful organization if you're interested in restorative practices. So I would love to do some breakouts, and I think we probably have a good amount of people to do that. Otherwise we could do it together, but I think we should do breakouts. Oh yeah. And the questions I'd love to discuss, and then we can come back and share out what we found, is how have emotional intelligence, self-regulation, and resiliency shown up in your teaching practice? And that's whether you're in whatever context that is. So feel free to adapt that to fit what you have on your mind. How could mindfulness support adults in your context? Either adult modeling or just sort of adult sense of belonging and agency. And what's one thing from this conversation that you're taking back to your context? So Matt, if we can do breakout rooms, but I'd like to give ourselves a little bit of time to debrief if we can. How much time do we have left?
We have 30 minutes left.
Okay, so maybe if we did 15 minutes in breakout rooms and then 15 minutes to debrief.
Okay. How many people would you like in a group? Right now it's 5 to 6.
Well, I would love to hear, I know we had an interesting conversation. I'd love to hear from anyone. Can people, oh yeah, people can unmute themselves, right? They have that capacity. They don't need us to do it. Yeah, if anyone's willing to just sort of share some high level takeaways so we can all benefit from the kernels, in our groups, that would be lovely.
I'll get the ball rolling here. Heather, I just loved that simple 4-word phrase, stop, be, look, see. And we talked about that in my group. And I thought, I teach kindergartners. They're going every which way all of the time. But a lot of times they're so quick in their motions and loud in their volume that it'd be very easy to think that the entire class is that way, when in fact it's just a couple of them. So just a simple act of saying those 4 words in my head, stop, look, be, see, stop, be, look, see, will slow me down enough to notice, okay, it's just these couple of kiddos, and then I need to go to them and help them.
Mhm.
And it's not everyone, you know. So, and then we also had talked about how super simple as an adult, you know, I don't know about you, but you ever be in a traffic jam and you're sitting there going, why is no one moving? The light is green. And then you didn't realize until you got to the light that something was going on. And so just taking that moment to stop and think there might be something else on ahead.
Mhm.
So
Thank
I
you.
appreciated such a simple technique that could be used in the classroom or for yourself.
Thank you for sharing that and for starting us off bravely. Anyone else willing to share just something that surfaced in your group? Okay. I think so. Actually, I was going to share the last screen that I have is just sort of like the resources I use, but I just realized everyone has access to the slides. So I don't, well, I can put them up. Let's see. Can you see this slide deck again? Okay. So here's just some places to look. And then also just really recommend that people who found some of this interesting, especially the work with the competencies, go to CASEL's website. There is so much there. Sometimes we've been told an overwhelming amount, but there is a CASEL school guide that can really help think through structuring SEL in your school. And we also have the program guide, which includes a lot of programs to choose from, including some programs that are specifically mindfulness programs, and 1 or 2, not as many, that blend mindfulness and SEL in a more comprehensive way. And that is it. I've included my email address. So I hope that you'll feel free to reach out with questions or just triumphs or anything. And appreciate all the work that everyone is doing to support students. If there's any questions, I think we have a few minutes, but also happy to let you take a break before the next presentation. So feel free to hop off if you are ready. Thank you.